Hi, I'm Mark Gaylor. I'm a Sony imaging ambassador. Now, I want to show you how I try to avoid missing shots because I've got inappropriate settings in the camera. Now, you're probably aware that I shoot a broad range of subjects from portraits through to rapidly moving subjects, which I call action, and then also landscapes. Now, I need to be able to move the appropriate settings very quickly. I can't be trusted to go diving into the menus to choose various options because I've changed the subject matter that I'm shooting. So you're probably aware that I also make movies about how you can set up and save groups of settings to the register them in the menus and then recall them from the shoot mode dial. Now we can access these via the MR setting on the shoot mode dial or one of the numbered memory settings from 1, 2 and 3. We also have the option of saving an additional 4 memory settings to a memory card. I do have a movie called Total Recall that looks at that particular workflow. The focus of this one is just to show how I use these groups of settings to not only photograph maybe portraits with the portrait memory setting, but also choose to use that setting for shooting alternate subject matter. So let's take a look at first of all that I do actually have resource movies for you to look at where I outline my settings that I shoot portraits with, that I shoot action images with, and also landscapes, both handheld and also using tripods. If you're looking at my website and you see that I've got ebooks available for many of the alpha cameras, you download them and you can see I also list those appropriate settings that I put into my memory settings on the camera. And again, I've outlined them for portraits and for action and for handheld landscapes and also for landscapes using tripods, perhaps where I need to extend the shutter speed. Now, I've also got appropriate settings for street photography, where we dictate the exposure given by the weather, and also I've got the appropriate settings for shooting movies. Now, typically I will write in the settings, the starting point for shooting movies as shutter priority, but with any of these starting point settings, I will modify them as I start working. For instance, if I put an ND filter when shooting movies, I will actually often switch from shutter priority to manual exposure mode. Now, I just want to outline why I'm choosing certain settings for shooting particular subject matter. Now, I actually refer to the settings on some of my cameras where I have 1, 2 and 3 as my PAL, portrait for number 1, action for number 2 and landscape for number 3. I could also refer to these settings as my SAD settings because the portrait is actually dictated by choosing shallow depth of field. So that would be the S for SAD. And action, I need to choose a very fast shutter speeds to freeze a rapidly moving subject traveling towards the camera. And my D for SAD would be my deep focus. And this is typically what I choose to work with when shooting landscape. Let's take a look at what it is that I'm actually choosing to put into the memory setting for landscape handheld, and that would be deep focus. I need to get focus from the foreground right through to the distant subject matter, which would be the mountains in this particular example. I need to maintain the optimum ISO, the lowest possible, but because this is a handheld landscape setting, when very low ambient light, I will allow the ISO to climb if it is required. And I'll also try and move the focus point to the foreground because I don't want to be focusing on the distance when I'm shooting landscape, because I do want that deep focus, and I can usually achieve that with F11 by using a hyperfocal distance. Now, how that plays out, if I was just to move my shoot mode dial to number 3 and take this image very quickly without considering my settings, Generally, I am always going to get the shot because I'll be shooting at f11. The focus will be brought forward slightly because I'll have a spot focus closer to the bottom of the frame, which will typically be foreground subject matter. And I'll have my ISO set to auto and my ISO auto minimum shutter speed set to slower. This is because with this type of setting, I know I'm going to be trying to hold the camera very still. The steady shot will be on, and I know I can hold shutter speed slower than 1/60th of a second. Now, in this instance, it doesn't need to use one of the very slower shutter speeds because it's only slowed down to 1/60th of a second. So even on a sort of a slightly overcast day, I'm still going to be shooting this particular subject matter with the optimum ISO 100 at f11, and I'm going to get that shot. I might choose to modify those settings in some instances, but it's a starting point and I won't miss the shot with this particular starting point. Another example, using an ultra wide angle lens. Again, the shutter speed hasn't slowed down to 160, below 1/60th of a second. And the focus point is set in this instance. I've just moved that AF focus point just to the, not to the lower portion of the image, but off to the left now, just so I'm focusing just 4 or 5 meters into this image in order to get a deep focus in this instance. Now, when the ambient light does get a little bit lower, the ISO auto minimum shutter speed set to slower does allow the shutter speed to go slower than 1/60th. In this instance, it's just dropped to 1/30th of a second. It won't drop too slow if it can actually get this exposure with 100 ISO. So again, I've not made any modifications to the number 3 memory setting on my shoot mode dial. Now, I do have the camera set up so I don't have to lower the camera from my eye if I do need to make an adjustment to either the ISO auto minimum shutter speed, to the focus area, exposure compensation, etc. I've got access to all of those controls with the camera at my eye. If Sony ever did bring in a touch screen for choosing menu items, I probably wouldn't use it, to be honest, because I can change all of my settings much more quickly by just using these custom keys and the features on the top back of the camera. So I've changed the nature of the C1 custom key to ISO auto minimum shutter speed. C2 I've left the default, which is the focus area, and I can move that focus area using the multi-selector tool or joystick on the back of the camera. I can make exposure compensation if the ISO auto is slightly overexposing or underexposing the image. And I've also programmed the AEL key as an override to my memory shoot settings, and I'll discuss that in more detail later. So as I said, I can usually modify any of those settings. If I just, for instance, press the FN key and just access one of my frequently used menu items, I can modify those settings using the front and rear dial. I don't actually need to lower the camera and look at the monitor to make those adjustments. Let's take a look at instances where I do override, say, one of my memory presets, in this instance, my landscape handheld. In this instance, I'm using a 200-600mm lens at 200 millimeters. Now, the subject matter doesn't have deep focus, or doesn't require deep focus, because I'm a long way from the subject matter. So, because the ambient light is very low, I've decided to open up the aperture from the f11 to the maximum aperture of the lens, which is 6.3 in this instance. And the reason I'm doing that is to keep the ISO as low as possible. In this instance, it's still going off at 1600 ISO. Because the ISO auto minimum shutter speed is still set to slower, it's allowing the shutter speed to slow down quite significantly for a 200mm focal length. In this instance, it's taken the image at 1/60th of a second. Now, I will make allowances to try and keep the camera as steady as possible, even though I'm being helped out by steady shot. And that is, I'll typically drop to one knee, put my elbow on my knee, and support the lens and then squeeze the shutter speed very slowly. I'll also take 2 or 3 images just to ensure I've got one that is critically sharp. Now, when I'm using an ultra wide angle lens, the shutter speed will be allowed to go significantly slower. Now, there is a reciprocal relationship between the shutter speed with auto ISO and the focal length of the lens. So typically, if you are using a focal length of say like 100 millimeters, and you were using the standard ISO auto minimum shutter speed, it would want to take the picture at 100th of a second. But if you select slow, it gives the camera permission to maybe take a picture at 1/50th of a second. And if you select slower, then it will give the camera permission to use 1/25th of a second. In this instance, because I'm using a 1635 GM lens and the ISO auto minimum shutter speed is set to slower, it'll slow down to 1/8th of a second. Now I know I can actually hand hold the vast majority of images at 1/8th of a second, so long as I am holding the camera appropriately and I'm squeezing the shutter release gently. So again, I will take 2 or 3 images, but I'm pretty much guaranteed that 2 out of these 3 images will be critically sharp. So this is where I always say that I will often go into a memory setting and then make a minor modification. In this instance, I've just opened up one aperture from f11 to f8 in order to try and keep that ISO still at 100. If I hadn't have done that, the ISO would have climbed to 200 in order to get that appropriate shutter speed and that with that aperture setting. In some of the landscape work I do, I'm not using ultra wide angle lenses. So here's an example where I've gone into the memory setting number 3, but I've made a couple of modifications. In this instance, I've opened up from f11, which is my default for that memory setting, and opened up 2 aperture values to f5.6. And the reason I've done that again is to keep the ISO as low as possible. And also I've chosen to raise the shutter speed slightly by moving the ISO auto minimum shutter speed from slower to slow. And the reason I've done that is because I'm actually shooting this landscape image from a slow moving boat. So I just need to make sure that the shutter speed doesn't slow down too much. Again, an override, I've opened up 2 stops because I don't have any foreground subject matter where I require that depth of field. And again, because I'm using a telephoto lens, I've just decided to move the ISO auto minimum shutter speed from slower to slow. So just 2 very quick adjustments. Had I shot this just with the standard memory setting number 3, I still probably would have got the shot. It's just that as I start thinking more carefully about the optimum settings, I might move away from that starting point. In this instance, I've thought more carefully about this setting. I've decided again to open up a couple of apertures just to render that distant horizon line slightly out of focus, to give that figure ground separation. And I've gone into the ISO auto minimum shutter speed, and instead of setting slow or slower, I've actually gone in and selected a specific shutter speed. That's 1/15th of a second, and that was dictated by the amount of movement drag that I wanted on the water coming around the side of that shell. So I would again just take one shot with the starting point, and then as I take a subsequent shot, I'll start modifying those settings. If I have modified any of those settings and I just need to go back to the default, I just need to turn the shoot mode dial away from my memory preset and then back, and again the default settings that I've registered in will start. So let's take a look at my landscape settings for when using a tripod. Now I'll still want that deep focus and I'll still want that hyperfocal distance. I'll often switch from an auto focus to maybe a manual focus point. and I'll actually dial in the distance of my hyperfocal distance. I don't really need to rely on autofocus in these particular instances. Now, instead of using auto ISO and ISO auto minimum shutter speed, I'll actually select the optimum ISO value for the camera, and that is usually 100 ISO. So this means in low ambient light, and especially when I'm using ND filters, the shutter speed will be too long for me to hand hold, but that's okay. This is my tripod settings, and so I'll have that extended shutter speed, which might go more than 1 second. Now again, this is using those tripod settings, and it does allow the shutter speed to slow down. In this instance, it's 2/5 of a second. Now, when reviewing this first image, I would actually just zoom in and check that moving ship is actually sharp at 2/5 of a second. And I think I just about got away with it. Otherwise, I would have again maybe raised the ISO value to raise the shutter speed so that it wasn't quite so long. One of the great things about using the mirrorless cameras is we can actually choose the hyperfocal distance by setting the focus to something reasonably close to the lens, and then using magnify view to check whether the horizon line is still critically sharp, and if it's not, we may need to move that focus point back a little bit. So again, just using the standard tripod settings, which would be f11. This is on a 16-35 GM lens. I've got an ND64 just to smooth the water, and I've allowed the shutter speed to go up to 30 seconds. I would have just used magnify view to check whether the foreground objects or in this image are still sharp, and also whether the distant objects. Now you can do that when reviewing the image, or you can actually do it before you actually take the image. As you use longer focal length lenses, then that hyperfocal distance will move back. I don't really need that in this instance, and I could have opened up wider if required, but again, it's a tripod setting, so I'm just happy to let the shutter speed go as long as it needs to get that appropriate exposure. And again, my tripod settings, using a much heavier ND filter now. Again, just my standard settings. Now, this is actually shot with an APS-C camera. And when I'm using or dialing in the memories for the APS-C cameras, sometimes I will choose a slightly wider aperture because we are getting more depth of focus with those smaller sensor cameras. So in this instance, I might have just used an f8 in the memory registered memory for this camera. Now, this is where I will often choose, just because it's a landscape, I don't always use my landscape setting. So in this instance, there was like a real gale, very high wind coming off the ocean, and waves were crashing into this rock called Sugarloaf Rock off the west coast of Australia. And so in this instance, it wasn't appropriate to use slow shutter speeds because I wanted to be able to freeze the waves crashing into this scenery. Now, so what I chose to do is not shoot this scene with my landscape setting, but instead move from 3 to 2 on the shoot mode dial and use my action settings instead. Now, my action settings have 1/2000th of a second as the default, and that will freeze the crashing waves in the rock. Now, my action settings do use the wider apertures that I'm able to use to allow me to use those fast shutter speeds without the ISO climbing too high. But in this instance, I've got away with it because I'm using a wide angle lens, and the subject matter that's close to the lens isn't that close. So I'm actually pulling the depth of field even at that wide f4 aperture. Okay, so another reason I might choose to shoot a landscape with my action settings was in this example here, where we have the foreground of the city of Fuji industrial area, and we're looking out towards Mount Fuji in the distance. Now, had I been in front of this scene, handheld or landscape, I could have chosen to use my F11, my landscape settings, but I'm not out in the open. I'm actually traveling on a train that's traveling over 300 kilometers an hour. It's the bullet train, and so I need to use my action settings to freeze the rapid movement of myself on the train. And also my action settings do have continuous shooting in the drive mode because I can't frame this precisely when the train is moving 300 kilometers an hour. So I'm actually shooting at 8 frames per second, so I can choose the best framing in post-production. And again, using my action settings to shoot this, and again, because I'm on a moving boat, I don't particularly need that f8 or f11 aperture because all of the subject matter is in the distance, so I don't need to pull focus on the foreground. This image was actually taken with my handheld landscape settings, but I just wanted to show you that as I'm working and I'm choosing maybe different subject matter to shoot at this location, I don't go into the menus to change those settings very often. Sometimes I will just roll the shoot mode dial just to one of my different memory settings. In this instance, I've just rolled from number 3 on the shoot mode dial to number 1, which are my portrait settings. Now, this isn't a portrait, but what I'm doing is I'm accessing settings that I use for portraits, which is shallow depth of field, figure ground separation with a reasonably quick shutter speed to freeze something that might be moving. So that's ideal for maybe flowers that might be just moving slightly in a little bit of breeze here. And what this does is it helps me to isolate. So quickly I've just gone from number 3 to number 1 on the shoot mode dial, and this allows me to isolate detail in, say, a landscape setting. And again, these would just be my default portrait settings. And then if I go back to the wider landscape shot, I'll just move from 1 back to 3 and then start shooting the bigger picture. These were all some detail shots that I shot in Japan on a recent trip. Now, I'll just outline my portrait settings because we've referred to them and why I've chosen the settings for what I choose to put into number 1 on the shoot mode dial, which I call portrait, part of that PAL or PAL acronym there. Now, as I said, it does choose aperture priority with a wide aperture. Now, I'll typically have a starting point of f4. Now, the reason I choose f4 is if a head just moves slightly to an angle, it does allow me to get reasonable focus on the eye that is a little bit further away from the camera. The eye AF will typically pick the eye that's closest to the camera. So shallow depth of field is definitely a priority in these instances. So this portrait setting isn't really ideal for group portraits where you need to pull deeper focus. Now, I might actually start with number 1 on my shoot mode dial, but if I was doing a group setting, I would just close the aperture down 2 or 3 stops. Now, my ISO auto minimum shutter speed is not set to standard, it's set to fast because I don't ask my subjects to stay still. So I do want to maybe freeze a subject that I'm photographing that might just be turning their head slowly. I do want to get a crisp, sharp focus in those instances. And I'll have face detect and IAF enabled there. Occasionally, however, well, in fact, most of the time, if I'm using a prime lens, I'll actually, the first thing I do after choosing 1 on my shoot mode dial is just to open the aperture either on the lens of a GM lens or on the rear wheel on the back of the camera. And instances where the ambient light is very low, I might open up to the widest aperture. In this instance, the only adjustment I've made after starting to shoot on 1 on the shoot mode dial is just to choose f1.8 as the aperture, just to keep the ISO as low as possible. In this instance where the ambient light is very high, I'm still choosing 1.8 on my 85mm lens. This is actually captured on an APS-C camera. Now the shutter speed, even though I've got it set to fast, will probably be shooting off at 1/4000th of a second because the ambient light is very bright and I'm using a very wide aperture on the lens. And the reason I'm doing this is just to get that figure ground separation to isolate the subject that I'm photographing. And because those shutter speeds are very high, I'm going to be freezing people even if they're walking or even running towards the camera. Again, if I'm using a prime such as the GM with a 1.4 aperture, I might be still using that very shallow depth of field. Now, if the character does turn their head so to its 3/4 view to the lens, the trailing eye may be out of focus when using these ultra wide apertures. It's interesting to note as well, we will be pulling those 1/8000th of a second on a sunny day, and in some instances where we've got a maximum of 1/4000th of a second on some of the APS-C cameras, it might not actually be possible to get these ultra wide aperture shots. Okay, so again, I actually shot this event all with the 85mm lens at 1.4, just with my standard portrait setting, and then rolling the aperture wider. And I am getting that figure ground separation even as I'm stepping back from the subject matter. And again, just trying to build in some other information into these shots just to build up the narrative and communication of the story that I'm recording. Now, on a previous year to a similar sort of demonstration, I actually shot it with the 100-400 telephoto GM lens, but it's same again, just my standard portrait settings. Now, the default is to start at f4, but at the longer telephoto reach of this lens, the maximum aperture is f5.6. And so what the standard memory setting will do is if it can't hit the f4, it'll choose the aperture that is nearest to it. Again, the ISO auto minimum shutter speed is set to that fast setting. Again, if I choose to try and isolate some detail at this event, I'm still using my portrait setting for that fine detail. Again, I'm using my standard portrait settings, except rolling the aperture wider, especially when I'm using an ultra wide angle lens. This is the 24 GM, so I will be using that f1.4 aperture to get some figure ground separation. Otherwise, that background will start coming into sharp focus very quickly on a wide angle lens. Just stepping back a little bit from this subject matter, the depth of field does grow a little, but I'm still getting a little bit of figure and ground separation courtesy of that f1.4 aperture. And just stepping back a little bit does allow me to get a little bit more information about what this guy is praying to in this particular situation here. Now, again, my portrait settings for shooting a series of images just with this one character, and I decided not to change lenses in this sequence. So I get my sort of 3/4 length portrait with my standard portrait settings at the 100mm focal length. And this is using the maximum aperture, which is f4.5 at 100mm. As I zoom in, I've got a sort of a little bit of a darker background, not the sky, but a distant mountain here, just to get that figure ground separation where his hat is the brightest thing. I'll be using a little bit of exposure compensation in this image just so I don't lose the detail in that sunlit brim of the hat there. But again, just my standard portrait settings. And again, just standard portrait settings on both of these portraits. And if I shoot some detail, maybe just a hand on the saddle or wherever, again, just my standard portrait settings. Now, as the guy jumps onto one of the horses and starts riding with his dog running beside him, I quickly move from my number 1 on my shoot mode dial to number 2 on the shoot mode dial, so I can now freeze the fast action. And again, I'll use that as my starting point. So you can see I don't have to drop the camera from my eye. in order to choose different settings. I can just make those quick adjustments very quickly as the action unfolds in front of me. Now, one of the things that if I am shooting portraits in this with the latest firmware updates and the latest cameras that are appearing, I will actually have the subject detection put on the function menu. Now we're actually looking on the back of the camera here, but I'd actually be making this switch from human to animal if I want the horse's eye to be sharp rather than the human eye, and I'll be doing that with the camera at my eye, just using selecting the FN key and then using the front dial just to change from human to animal in this instance. And obviously I would do that as soon as I go to the zoo or I'm shooting wildlife out on location. I am just going to try to remember when I'm shooting my portrait setting just to switch over to animals when appropriate. And one of the great things about I've just seen on the A7R4 in the function menu, we can have different function menus for shooting stills and for shooting movies. So an incredibly useful feature for when we are switching between movies and stills, and we're often running out of 12 favorite settings to put in the function menu. Always avoiding trying to go into the actual menus itself, which I think I can successfully do. I very rarely go into the menus except perhaps to format a card. There are a couple of menu items I've just put in the My menu, so I don't have to remember which page they appear on in the full menus. And again, just my standard portrait settings, because I'm using maybe a 100-400 with a 1.4 teleconverter, it can't hit that starting point of f4 that's registered, so it just goes to the nearest aperture. With, in this instance, it would be an f8 on this combination here. Still getting the shallow depth of field because of the extreme telephoto focal length. And again, this is on the 200-600 standard portrait settings with animal eye detect selected. And again, this is the maximum aperture on this lens at this focal length, 600mm, which is f6.3. Now, portrait settings, as I move very close to my subject matter, I do have to be aware that depth of field starts to get very narrow as I move. Now, in some instances, that's very appropriate, as in this image here. In some instances, however, it can get too narrow, and I might actually lose some areas that I did want in sharp focus, so I do have to be aware of that. Now, my starting aperture that you might choose to be wider than I'm choosing, but my f4 starting aperture does allow me to do maybe a two-people portrait, but only so long as both sets of eyes are the same distance from the lens. If one person is standing behind the other, the f4 on a full frame sensor won't be enough to get both people's eyes sharp. So when I am doing portraits with two people, if I'm not absolutely sure that both people are the same distance, I'll actually start f4 but maybe stop down to 5, 6 or even further. In this instance, because I've moved very close, I've actually stopped down to 5.6. But if you were looking at critical sharpness, the monkey that appears in the top left-hand corner, although the whiskers on the mouth are pin sharp, the eyes are just getting a little bit soft for my liking. Now, two ways around this is I could stop down even more, but the ISO was already starting to climb because it was a rainy day. So the other thing that I could have done is just take a couple of steps back and then crop in post, because stepping back would also increase the depth of field. In this instance, because I'm pretty sure that the child is a little bit further back than the father's head, so what I've done on the aperture wheel is just roll that a couple of times. Sometimes I'm not counting the number of clicks or looking at the actual aperture. I just need to stop down very quickly so I don't lose the moment. In this instance, I've managed to stop down from f4 to f8 just to ensure that both people are critically sharp. Also having to be aware that if I actually do this, the background is going to start coming into focus quite quickly. So I might need to take a half a step to the left or right just to frame up and get an appropriate background for my subject matter, because I can no longer trust to the out of focus bokeh taking care of any distractions to the portrait. So again, at events, if I'm not too sure or I don't have time to assess whether the two people are exactly the same distance from the lens, just stopping down from the f4 to 5, 6 for these portraits. And obviously if you're doing more than two people and you've got people standing behind the people in the front row, you will probably want to stop down more than f8 and then choose an appropriate background that isn't distracting. So in this instance, I was actually just quite lucky because it was very difficult to assess whether these two girls, their eyes would be pinned sharp. They actually are, but I wouldn't have been able to determine that at a street parade type situation. And as I went in to get a tighter headshot of these two girls, I did instinctively just roll the aperture down. Now I've actually rolled down to 4.5 from the, I was actually shooting the whole parade at 1.8, but on these close-up portraits, I just roll down to f4.5 in this instance. And again, if you're thinking that these two girls might be a little bit staggered in distance, then you might want to have actually just swipe a third time just to close that aperture down a little bit more. Again, you can return to your optimum aperture either by moving the aperture wheel to get that back to that 1.8 as you start shooting the parade again, or you could just turn away from number 1 and then turn back to number 1 on the shoot mode dial, and that will start at that f4 starting point that I've registered into my memory. Okay, so this is my standard portrait settings opening up one aperture, so just a single modification there. Now, if I did decide to, perhaps I don't use off-camera flash very often, but in an instance where I do, I might start with my portrait settings and then on the exposure compensation wheel just roll down to -2 just to lower the brightness of the background behind the sitter. This will make the flash the dominant light source in this instance, and because it's being softened through a softbox, I'm actually getting a reasonable quality of lighting on the face. Now this is with the flash in TTL mode, so the flash compensation is still set to 0, but the ambient compensation via the exposure compensation wheel on the top of the camera is going down to -2. Let's take a look at my action memory settings. And the starting point, which is number 2. Now I'd always, if you're just restricted just to 2 memory settings on your shoot mode dial, such as the A7 III camera, I would sort of advise you maybe to put in the action settings at least into one of those memory settings, because you do need at least 6 or 7 settings to be assured of actually getting fast action pin sharp. Now, my major priorities is to get a shutter speed that will freeze rapidly moving subject matter that's coming towards the camera. And a good starting point for that would be 1/2000th of a second. I also need to track that fast action. So I will be thinking about the focus settings as well. And I'll also be using the drive mode set to continuous shooting. Now, if there's a risk that I might pan the camera, I'll have that set to high, not high plus, on the A7 cameras and the A6K cameras as well. Because the high plus, you won't get a live feed to the finder as you're trying to pan, which makes panning exceptionally difficult. My in this instance, I'll be having a starting point of f4. If your telephoto lens doesn't have a maximum aperture of f4, it'll again just go to the nearest aperture it can get to. The ISO auto minimum shutter speed is not set to fast or faster, it's set to 1/2000th of a second. And I'll start with my AF tracking set to wide. If you're using a camera with the older lock-on AF, you might consider just starting with wide. The lock-on AF can get a little bit twitchy, so that is just personal preference whether to start with wide or lock-on AF wide. I find that the new AF tracking is much more reliable, so I'm much more likely to write that into my starting preset. But the focus area, I do like to start with the wide focus areas because 90% of the subjects that I shoot are front and center, and those algorithms are typically brought into play, and I get a good hit rate with starting with the wider focus areas. Especially on the Sony cameras, which have the phase detect autofocus pretty much covering the entire sensor these days, it will pick up your subject matter if you haven't been able to manage to center it in the viewfinder, or it becomes off center when tracking with the camera. And just some more examples to show how reliable a wide focus area is. I really only need to drop down and use a smaller focus area if there are obstacles in the way. If I'm using a lens that has a wider aperture, I might even choose to do that, especially on the late model cameras, which has got very reliable focus, and some of the faster focusing lenses we can trust to using wider apertures, such as this instance where I'm using a 135 lens at f2.8. And in this instance I've got a teleconverter on the 400mm prime, so we're dropping down to f4, and I've actually increased the shutter speed because it's a very bright day to 1/4000th of a second to absolutely get the best chances of freezing this fast action as it comes round at an incredible speed in this MotoGP. Now I've actually gone into a memory override here. Now, in most instances, I'm freezing subject matter that's coming towards the camera, but in some instances, I want to create a little bit of movement blur if I'm panning the camera very rapidly. So I will try to slow the shutter speed down. For people who are not very practiced at panning, you do run the risk of losing more images as you slow your shutter speed down. Now, what I'm trying to do in this instance, if I can pan accurately, I'll still freeze the subject using 1/500th of a second, but the subject matter behind my subject will start to streak and blur. In this instance, it's only the racetrack itself that's blurring, but it does give that sense of motion. So I've closed down from maybe my starting point of f4 to f8, and I've set my ISO auto minimum shutter speed to 1/500th of a second. Now you could actually go and use even slower shutter speeds, but you do have to just check how slow, or sorry, what aperture you can actually stop down to on your particular camera and still have phase detect autofocus that is tracking and moving the focus through a whole sequence. On the A7R2 and A7R3 cameras, you can't actually stop down more than f8. And on the A7R4, A7 III, A9 cameras, we can stop down f11, and in the A9 with the firmware upgrade we can stop down to f16 to get much slower shutter speeds. Now, the slower shutter speeds for creating movement blur is not dependent on the speed of your subject, it's dependent on the speed that you're actually panning the camera, because what we're blurring is actually stationary subject. Okay, so in this instance I've stopped down to f11. Now I've set ISO auto minimum shutter speed to 1/250th because I want to blur the crowd behind this motorcyclist as much as possible. In this instance, because I'm using not shutter priority or manual exposure with auto ISO, because I'm using aperture priority and ISO auto minimum shutter speed, if the camera can't hit that designated shutter speed without underexposing or overexposing the image, it will modify that shutter speed. The 1/250th was the target, but in this instance, if it had actually used 1/250th, it would have overexposed the bright highlights in this image. So the camera actually selected 1/320th of a second to protect my highlights because it was a very bright day. Now this is an example where I'm starting with my standard action settings, but now I'm modifying the focus area just by pressing the C2 key, and I'll just roll the front dial or the rear dial if it's one of the tracking options or lock on AF options. And I'll move from wide down to zone. Now the zone only has 9 positions on the screen, so it's very easy to basically rule out any of the obstacles. And when I'm referring to obstacles, I'm referring to subject matter that might be closer than the subject that I'm photographing and maybe closer to the center. And this is a good example where the horse on the left side of this image is getting quite close to the center, and it's closer to the camera than the cowboy with the cow there. And so the camera is at risk using a wide AF area of snapping focus on the closest subject matter. And so just by moving down to zone and excluding the obstacle, again the camera is going to be very reliable in choosing and tracking that subject. In some instances I will use the spot AF either in the tracking or just the starting point. In this instance, because I'm waiting for the bird to take to the wing, and my reactions will always be a little bit behind the bird taking to flight, so I've actually used a focus area right on the edge of the phase detect autofocus area towards the left side of the frame here. And then as the bird takes flight, because it's one of the AF tracking options, or the lock-on AF options, the focus point will just shift automatically across the frame as the bird takes to flight. Now, one of the things that I will override, now I was actually capturing this kingfisher, and I was hoping to get it in flight using my action settings. Now, occasionally the bird wasn't looking into the water, so I was pretty sure it wasn't going to take to the wing. So 1/2000th of a second would have just pushed the ISO really, really high unnecessarily, because I'm not trying to freeze the rapidly moving subject. I'm just trying to capture a bird sitting reasonably still. So I will try and override. Now I could do that in a number of different ways. I can just go into ISO auto minimum shutter speed and take it down from 1/2000th of a second to slow or slower, and this will allow it to slow down. Or alternatively, I do use the register custom shoot settings, and then I can draw on those registered custom shootings using the custom hold. Now I've programmed that to the AEL button to recall one of those registered custom shoot settings. In this instance, I've just overridden my action settings, so I'll go down from the continuous shooting to single shooting, because I'm just wanting one picture of the bird sitting still, and I'll also go down from the 1/2000th of a second to 1/320th of a second in shutter priority. Now you have up to 10 settings that you can register, but I will typically only just register 2, sometimes 3, to override by holding down my custom recall hold there. Again, another example of that, I've been capturing this woman who has been running using the continuous high shooting setting, so many frames per second, but she stops to start removing her wetsuit, and so I just hold down my AEL button just to shoot one shot at 1/320th of a second shutter speed, which is more than ample to freeze a subject with a telephoto lens. And here basically is I'm showing you how I've programmed this, and you can program this on the A6K series cameras as well. We don't have an AEL button, well, we do have a toggle switch on some of the A6K cameras, but you can program even the AF/MF key to recall the custom hold. Now typically I will set my recall custom hold to my memory setting 2. What I would dearly love is that as I moved my shoot mode dial from 1, 2 and 3, it would actually pull up the recall custom hold 1, 2 and 3 for different overrides depending on what I'm shooting, but that isn't the current behavior. You actually have to quickly dive into the menu in order to reassign your custom key to a different recall custom hold. Now I'm hoping in the future that won't always be the case, because this is the longest thing that I have to do in a menu, and you can actually set up a my menu item so you can get there just a little bit faster, but it will take me 5 or 6 seconds to change the functionality of that custom key if I'm switching genres very quickly. Another group of settings that I might write to a card, and if I've run out of settings on the camera, I will write it to the M1, M2, M3 or M4 settings. Just a word of warning, if you do reformat the card, you will wipe out those settings you've saved. But I'll often typically put a camera card in my camera bag which have just got saved memory settings, so I can load one from a memory card, eject that card, and then start shooting with settings that I did retrieve from a memory card. My street settings follow the Sony 16 rule. Sometimes on a full frame camera I will actually shoot at the f16, but on the APS-C cameras I will actually modify that to the f8 and B there. So I'm still exposing for sunny conditions. I'm just using a slightly wider aperture because the depth of field on a wide angle lens on an APS-C camera is sufficient at f8, and it does help to keep the ISO a little bit lower. And there are maybe some of the settings I might have written to the card there. 1/500th of a second should freeze somebody who's walking. f8, ISO 125. Now that will be in manual exposure mode for this particular genre, and I typically change the exposure if and when the weather changes rather than trusting to auto exposure. And just to show you how effective those setting up for weather conditions is in very tricky lighting conditions here, we still don't risk overexposing any of the highlights. So very tricky conditions with dark backgrounds, shooting in towards light, or the sun's almost in the shot there. We're getting sun reflected off windows behind me. Very difficult to meter, but if you just set up for sunny weather, then you're going to get a reliable exposure. And again, just using those settings, as the sun goes in, I might need to modify my street settings by using the ISO, which is the setting that I do allow to move, because I still want the shutter speed to freeze moving action, not for my sport type action, but just for somebody who might be walking quickly, or in this case, somebody who's pushing a pram at quite a speed there. And because it's not sunny weather, I'll have just doubled and then maybe doubled again my ISO to ensure that the exposure is appropriate for a cloudy sky. And when it gets very cloudy, you might need to expose or compensate for the dark conditions a couple of times. And because on my street settings I'm using a manual exposure, I'm just doing that manually. I'll take one image and just check the exposure is appropriate, and then carry on using that exposure setting until the weather changes again. Now, one of the things that I have been playing with, especially as the IAF has become increasingly reliable on late model alpha cameras, is instead of relying on depth of field to always get my subject sharp, I'm relying on IAF. And this has allowed me to start shooting my street photography with my portrait settings. And especially with some of my prime lenses, I'll start shooting at the very wide apertures to get a really extensive figure ground separation, such as in this instance where I've been shooting with a 135 portrait lens at maximum aperture. And it's still street photography in my books, but not the typical sort of street settings that you might encounter. So I'm not trying to put people into straitjackets just by having 3 starting points and not modifying. I still am inviting other users to be very creative about the starting setting they start with, and then what modifications they make to that starting point. And as you've seen previously, I've used action settings to shoot landscapes. So just understanding what those starting points will do. And again, it's just another way of avoiding ever missing a shot, because those starting point settings, so long as you understand what they're capable of, are very reliable at always pulling out that first shot. And again, just using my portrait settings for shooting street at night, because I do want to use the wider apertures and I want to keep that ISO to a minimum. This one captured with the 24 GM lens, and I was even amazed to see that IAF was actually kicking in even in these very dark conditions. And again, just shooting street with my portrait settings on that 24 GM lens. And back to the 135 at maximum aperture, and this time the 85 1.8 on an APS-C camera. And that 85 at 1.8 on the APS-C camera, this is the A6400 camera, is I'm still getting that figure and ground separation, which I love about the full frame cameras. I can just about achieve it really effectively. And there, I decided to shoot a whole series of shots in Japan, street portraits, with that combination of APS-C camera, 85mm lens. And that one I think was working very effectively to isolate the subject from the background. This is back on the full frame camera, starting with my portrait settings as I move in to isolate some detail in this setting. Just not adjusting the setting, because my portrait settings are still appropriate for isolating detail. I might, if I did anything in this particular instance, I might just change the AF area and then roll maybe a spot onto the hand or onto the painting here, if I was being really fussy about where that focus occurred. And again, just to go back to my movie settings. Now, if you've watched some of my movies, sometimes I will be outlining that I start with shutter priority with those, but I know many people prefer to use manual. Manual does, however, if you're choosing to use maybe say 1/50th of a second as your shutter speed for shooting movies in bright sunny conditions, you will need those ND filters, and that is really why I start with shutter priority, because it does close the aperture down if it can't achieve that wide aperture and hold on to that slower shutter speed. Now, I also will dial in settings for my S and Q, slow and quick. And if I'm using or shooting, say, 100 frames per second on the quick S and Q dial, then my shutter speed would be 1/200th of a second for shooting at that higher frame rate. There, just showing you S and Q. Now, one of the things that you probably need to be aware of, if you're also using the memories, if you were to turn away from the memories, none of the settings you've been using in the memories will be held onto. So if you set the camera up for shooting movies using the movie on the shoot mode dial, or your manual settings, as you return to manual exposure mode or your movie mode, the settings you had in that mode before you went into your memory shoot mode numbers will be retained. So it's basically one more memory in effect, is because you can set your camera up for movies or street and not have to register that into a memory. Certainly very effective if you like the F8 and B there rule. Hopefully you found some of that information useful, and I think it's definitely something to put into practice. If you're accustomed just to shooting in aperture priority or shutter priority or program mode, and then choosing and cherry picking various settings for what you're shooting, and then being slightly frustrated that you might have missed one of the settings, like you're getting a little bit too much subject blur when you're editing your images in post, and you're sort of kicking yourself that you missed one of those settings, it's certainly an opportunity to rethink your own personal workflow and maybe just try out working off your memories instead of just predominantly working in, say, aperture priority. And this will certainly I think what it'll do for most people, it'll lower the number of missed shots because I know that if I had to cherry pick settings for everything that I shoot, I would occasionally be forgetful, especially if somebody's talking to me while I'm setting up the camera. I would shoot 2 or 3 images, realize and kick myself that I had an inappropriate setting, and then have to go and retake that image again. So this one works for me. Give it a go and maybe put some feedback underneath the movie. I do encourage you to subscribe to the channel. You can make a donation if you find this incredibly useful. Be sure to head over to my website first and foremost, because I have a lot of training resources, both for image capture, camera setup, and also post-production, and all of my resources are available for free, or you can make small donations, as I've said. If you do enjoy having specific questions answered, I would encourage you also to join as a paid member to my YouTube channel, because I have a dedicated Q&A forum for paid members, and I also run 1-hour live seminars each month for paid members, and I also offer a photo critique service for my paid members. Okay, so I'm Mark Gaylor, Sony Alpha Ambassadors. Give me a thumbs up and I'll catch you online next time.